Alarming new reporting indicates that a deranged Donald Trump seeks to go full Emperor Palpatine in a second potential presidential term, and everybody should be on guard. Intrigued? Then click that like, subscribe, and the alert bell, and maybe check out my Patreon, and enjoy the video. So those of you who don't watch the channel too closely, which you should change that, by the way, and like and subscribe immediately, but those of you who haven't followed the channel closely may not know that in addition to politics, I am a die-hard Star Wars fan. I've watched the movies, watched the TV shows, read the books, read the graphic novels, played the games. I mean, I am inundated in Star Wars. My geekery for Star Wars is unparalleled. That said, I mean, it actually makes sense, right? Because Star Wars is an inherently political setting, so these two interests tend to overlap. But that said, it does occasionally alarm me when real-world politics and Star Wars politics intersect. And this situation is one such example. So it seems like Donald Trump watched the prequel trilogy recently, and he's like, guys, that Sheev Palpatine, he seems like a pretty smooth operator, guys. And so he took away the wrong message of the prequels, which is that, Palpatine is the hero. And the reason I say that is because recent reporting, and this is ongoing reporting, as a matter of fact, because we've covered parts of this story months ago. This is an ongoing development. But anyway, Donald Trump and his inner circle, his policy shops, the people who are preparing for a potential second Trump administration, are apparently seeking to go full Emperor Palpatine. What do I mean? Well, according to the sobering report, this updated report from the New York Times, Jonathan Swan, Trump's advisors are seeking to radically expand the power of the executive branch and the power of the White House under Trump's control, and it is profoundly dangerous. Now, we won't read the full article here, but the bottom line is, take a step back a bit. So in politics, there is this notion, in political theory, there's this notion of a unitary executive theory, which I've discussed in previous videos because it is a very prominent Republican political philosophy. The idea is, according to adherents of unitary executive theory, that the Constitution empowers the president to have absolute control over the executive branch. Absolute control, not subject to checks and balances. Okay. Now, most people agree, the vast majority of political scientists agree that certainly the president should be by far the most powerful person in the executive branch and has wide supervisory and discretionary control over the executive branch. But there's debate over whether or not that control is absolute. Now, most political scientists believe that the president's authority should have checks and balances like all other branches of government, right? Congressional checks and balances, Supreme Court checks and balances. This idea that the framers intended to empower the president to have absolute control seems counterintuitive, especially when you consider, for example, like the cabinet. So the president can nominate members of his own cabinet, his highest ranking officers, but they still have to be approved by the Senate, right? The idea is basically, for people who want to do this, namely Republicans and conservatives, they want to turn the entire executive branch, which is by far the biggest of the three federal branches, by far. You're talking about millions of government employees, including the military as well. It's by far the biggest. To basically turn them all into at-will employees who serve at the pleasure of the president. Now think about that for a minute. The president is already the most powerful person in the country, and understandably so. That's the point of the executive branch, whereas the legislature, you have power divided among 535 voting members, 100 in the Senate, 435 in the House. In the Supreme Court, you have 9 justices and then a federal judiciary under them. The president, the office of the president is vested with the greatest amount of singular authority. But the idea that that shouldn't be subject to checks and balances is ridiculous, and it seems to run counterintuitive to what the framers intended, given that they had just waged a war to free themselves from the yoke of a monarch. You would basically, people who are proponents of a strong unitary executive, the kind that is being discussed in this article, would effectively make the president a term-limited monarch with absolute control. That's insane. It's incredibly dangerous, and especially dangerous if that particular executive were a bad faith malignant narcissist who is legendarily corrupt and incompetent, like Donald Trump. But basically the idea is to remove all those checks and balances, any sort of independent administrative agency like the EPA or the FEC or the Federal Reserve, anything like that, to bring them even more under the control of the executive branch under Donald Trump, because Trump felt that during his administration he was checked. He received too much pushback from people under him. So, like, for example, when he was under investigation by Robert Mueller, the special counsel, as Robert Mueller laid out in his findings, there were multiple attempts by Donald Trump to obstruct justice and to obstruct the investigation. At one point, Donald Trump gave the order to have Robert Mueller fired, but his staff refused to comply because there's a degree of separation. The president doesn't have the statutory authority to fire a special counsel directly. He would have to order the attorney general to do it, and then the attorney general would have to comply. Donald Trump basically wants to cut those steps out and be like, listen, if I want to fire somebody, if I want to go, you're fired, if he wants to go full apprentice on somebody, he feels that he should have the power to do it. That's incredibly dangerous. Mr. Trump intends to bring independent agencies like the Federal Communications Commission, which makes and enforces rules for television and internet companies, and the Federal Trade Commission, which enforces various antitrust and other consumer protection rules against businesses, under presidential control. Something else that he wants to do, and this kind of manifested itself during his perfect phone call to Ukraine, is he wants to revive the practice of impounding funds, refusing to spend money that Congress has appropriated for programs the president doesn't like, a tactic which was banned under President Nixon. So the idea is that Congress controls the power of the purse, and they fund all government agencies. And the idea is the president's obligated to spend that money, right? He can't just not spend the money or spend more money than Congress has apportioned, because that would basically undermine Congress's power of the purse. If the president just has absolute discretion to say, no, I'm not going to spend the money the way you want it, or no, I'm going to take these funds that you've appropriated for this purpose, but I'm going to use it here. And in the situation with Ukraine, Congress approved foreign aid to Ukraine. And the president does have some authority in terms of when and where he releases it, but the money does need to be spent, and it does need to be spent towards Ukraine. And Donald Trump threatened to stop paying Ukraine congressionally approved funds for foreign aid unless Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, investigated then candidate Joe Biden. So that was illegal, and part of it was outlawed under this idea that the president can't impound funds. Donald Trump wants to reverse that. Donald Trump wants to make it so that the president can choose when and where and how much of congressional funds to spend wherever he wants. This is incredibly dangerous, folks. The other thing that I've mentioned in previous videos is this notion that, so the president, I think it's like 4,000 employees, political appointees, that the president has appointed. He either directly appoints or his staff appoints. He basically has hiring and firing prerogatives at will over about 4,000 federal employees, which is quite a bit. But the vast majority of other employees have some protections against the president. They're not at-will employees. They have to be fired for cause. So like a big one, a really prominent one, is the chairman of the Federal Reserve, like Jerome Powell. Technically, the Federal Reserve is an executive branch agency, but it's also independent. So even though Jerome Powell reports to the president and is appointed by the president can't fire the chairman of the Federal Reserve unless he has cause, right? So that's why, for example, if President Biden were upset that Jerome Powell kept hiking interest rates, he can't just wake up one morning and say, you know what, Jerome, I don't like you. Get out of here, you're fired. Jerome Powell would actually have to do something to be legally considered cause for the president to fire him. Donald Trump wants to change that. Think about that. Think about being able to fire the chairman of the Fed because they are or are not affecting the sort of monetary policy which is beneficial to the president in the political term. Think about that. And there's actually no indication that the Fed would be immune from that. So this is incredibly dangerous. He wants to make all federal employees Schedule F, again, fireable, every single employee. So people like Dr. Fauci, because Dr. Fauci is retired, but, these state experts, these health experts, whatever. If Donald Trump doesn't like what they have to say, he feels he should be able to fire them and replace them with his own sycophants. That's incredibly dangerous. And again, the Supreme Court and Congress have upheld the notion that some of these executive agencies should be insulated from the president, number one, because these agencies actually have delegated powers from Congress. So like, for example, with the EPA, Congress has delegated some of its authority to some of these agencies because they recognize that they don't have the expertise or the time or the manpower to run these agencies on a day-to-day level. So like, okay, we'll create an executive branch department. They'll be funded with, bureaucrats and experts and people actually know the business, and they can make the day-to-day decisions in terms of regulation as long as they operate within the broad legislative remit that Congress has granted them. But if those agencies now serve at the pleasure of the president, literally on every level, then that would be the president appropriating congressional authority, making him even more powerful. And that's why Congress and the Supreme Court have rejected this idea for years that the president has absolute control over the executive branch. Again, that's so profoundly dangerous. He's already the most powerful person in the country, if not the world. And you want to make him, in terms of the largest and most active of the branches, the executive branch, you want to give him absolute control. He doesn't even have that for the military. Like, the president's control over the military is extraordinary. It's great. It's not absolute. He needs congressional approval to declare war, things like that. Congress actually sets up, the military code of conduct as well. That's not completely at the discretion of the president. The entire system is built on checks and balances so as to not give too much power to one person. And Donald Trump seeks to undermine it. And this is a Republican notion through and through. It began under Reagan, this notion of a very strong maximalist approach to unitary executive theory. And we should all be on guard. Think about it. Donald Trump feels that he was stymied and thwarted by patriots in these positions of power. Again, when he wanted to fire Bob Mueller, when he wanted to appoint Jeff Clark, I think was his name, the crazy guy who believed that the vice president in Mike Pence could just singularly overthrow the results of an election. Donald Trump wanted to make him the acting attorney general. And the only reason he didn't do it is because basically the top DOJ staff threatened to resign en masse and create huge amounts of chaos in the DOJ if Donald Trump did that. Donald Trump is going for broke. If he gets elected to a second presidential term, he intends to accrue absolute power as much as possible into his office, into the executive branch. And again, under any person, that would be incredibly dangerous. But under a vengeful, malignant narcissist who has nothing to lose and everything to gain and is so profoundly stupid and corrupt, I can't think of anything more dangerous. So everybody, pay attention to this. This, if nothing else, if absolutely nothing else, this right here is reason enough to not vote for Donald Trump, even if, and especially if, I would argue, you're a conservative.